We've all heard those famous opening lines of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. We also know that the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia appointed a committee of 5 to write the document, which included Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and John Adams of Massachusetts, as shown in the famous engraving by Currier and Ives produced on the 100th anniversary of the signing. Jefferson, who was chosen to write the first draft of the Declaration, wrote years after the Revolution that the committee's intention was not to find new principles or new arguments, but to place before mankind the common sense of the subject. It was intended to be an expression of the American mind. All its authority rests then on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversations, in letters, printed essays, or the elementary books of public rights, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason of Fairfax County, which the Virginia Convention meeting in Williamsburg passed just a few weeks before Jefferson sat down to draft the Declaration of Independence, surely gave Jefferson a clear notion of what the colonists were thinking. In Section 1, Mason wrote that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and processing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. The words of George Mason of Virginia. Jefferson and his fellow revolutionaries also drew on ideas from several famous scholars and politicians who lived in 18th century Europe years before the American Revolution. It was a period called the Enlightenment. The writers of the Enlightenment were critical of the monarchies that ruled Europe and the church which supported them. They stressed the basic principles of the rights of man and the strength of reasoning and scientific thinking over blind faith or obedience to the powers that be. Among them were the Englishmen John Locke, Algernon Sidney, and Isaac Newton, and the Frenchmen Charles de Montesquieu and Denis Diderot. John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, said, "Government being for the preservation of every man's right and property, by preserving him from the violence or injury of others, is for the good of the governed." John Locke also said, "The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. Where there is no law, there is no freedom." On the subject of revolution, John Locke said, "And thus the community perpetually retains the supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of anybody, even of their legislators, whenever they shall be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject." The words of John Locke. The Frenchman Charles de Montesquieu, writing in 1752, warned against citizens who are not involved in their government. He said, "The tyranny of a prince in an oligarchy is not so dangerous to the public welfare as the apathy of a citizen in a democracy." Montesquieu also said, "There is no crueler tyranny than that which is perpetrated under the shield of law and in the name of justice." Montesquieu also said, "To become truly great, one has to stand with the people, not above them." Jefferson and Franklin were great admirers of the Englishman Algernon Sidney, who lived from 1623 to 1683 and was executed for plotting against King Charles II. Jefferson, whose library included a copy of Sidney's book, Discourses, referred to it in a letter written in 1804, saying, "They are in truth a rich treasure of Republican principles. It is probably the best elementary book of the principles of government." Algernon Sidney wrote in his book, "It is not therefore the king that makes the law, but the law that makes the king." No law made by man can be perfect, and there must be in every nation a power of correcting such defects as in time may arise or be discovered. Words of Algernon Sidney. In the year 1751 in Paris, the Encyclopedia, a huge collection of articles on science, government, and art, was published. Much of the content was critical of the French monarchy and the church, ideas which spread from France across the Atlantic to the American colonies. The editor of the Encyclopedia, Denis Diderot, criticizing the divine right of kings, said, "No man has received from nature the right to command his fellow human beings." Words of Diderot. Yet another leading thinker of the Enlightenment, scientist Isaac Newton, once said, "If I have seen further than the others, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Without diminishing the glorious deeds of the American Revolution, it is important to remember that when Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he did not include millions of African slaves, Native Americans, and even women of all races. Although there were leaders at the time of the Revolution who publicly criticized slavery, it would be another 90 years after a bloody civil war before those slaves were legally freed, and another 100 years for their civil rights to be finally guaranteed by federal law. Furthermore, women, one half of the population, were not guaranteed the right to vote in the new United States of America until ratification of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. And Native Americans were not made full citizens until 1924. Inspired by the greatest thinkers of the ages, Thomas Jefferson put the yearning of his fellow Americans for liberty and freedom into the timeless words of the Declaration that still speak to us today. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor."